Welcome to Densify Talks. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. My name is Brian, and I'm the producer of the show. On this episode of Densify Talks, we welcome Mark Watson, CTO at ComplyAdvantage. We've got a lot to talk about today. Andrew and Mark get into a variety of topics, including cloud costs and optimization strategies. Mark shares his insights and experiences with cloud vendors, discussing the challenges of analyzing and predicting cloud growth and the importance of flexibility when choosing providers. Andrew and Mark discuss pricing in the cloud industry, shedding light on the sometimes overlooked nature of hardware and software costs. They delve into the world of optimization, test environments, and resource allocation. So many things coming up, even Mark's love for sci-fi and how our future may or may not come close to what's already been predicted. So I say we get into this. We've got a lot to share with you. Let's rock it. Here is your host, CTO and co-founder of Densify, Andrew Hillier.
Okay, thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Andrew Hillier, and today I'm joined by Mark Watson, the CTO of ComplyAdvantage. Thanks for joining us, Mark. Maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew. Yeah, so as you say, I am the Chief Technology Officer at ComplyAdvantage. I've been here about 18 months at this point. Before that, I was CTO of a company called World Remit, done the CTO job and sometimes the CEO job over the last 20 or so years, with a number of startups and scale-ups. And before that was at IBM for a while. At Comply, I manage all of technology, which includes mostly engineering, also includes infrastructure, so things like DevOps, security, data management, and some other functions as well, which are related to technology. All in all, about 250 people. We also have a data function, which is an adjunct to technology as well, which kind of sits alongside. I guess we'll get into later. What Comply does, we're basically a SaaS business that provides checking for various issues that might occur during transactions as regarding individuals around risk. So risk of financial crime, risk of money laundering, so it's anti-money laundering software, risk of fraud, risk of political exposure, various things that either regulators are interested in or our customers themselves are interested in around the individuals and businesses with whom they're dealing.
That's very interesting. So you could run this against me right now, and by the end of the podcast, you can report back on what kind of risk I am.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about that. I mean, we've been given a bunch of information by a customer of ours. There's obviously something called GDPR and data protection that would get in the way of me just kind of pulling up a screen and saying, what about Andrew Hillier? What's he been up to? You know, that's a big issue for us. We have to be very careful about those things. The data that we hold on behalf of customers there are issues around data sovereignty, stuff in one country can't leak into another country and so on. It's really a data-driven company, and with a lot of data comes great responsibility. So we have to be very careful about that.
Yeah, I mean, GDPR has had global ramifications. I think it affects everybody, even though it's obviously from Europe. So I'm sure it's extremely complicated to navigate all that. I've been looking forward to this discussion. Not only are you a serial CTO and obviously living right in this space, but in our discussion, I'm hoping you'll throw in some literary references, extensive literary knowledge, and can answer almost any question with a literary reference. And I was joking with him, it makes me feel like we're just living a path that's already been described in science fiction decades ago. And it's just the illusion of free will for us. We're really just following a preordained path.
Yeah, I already got the transcript for this conversation beforehand. I'm just reading it out.
Well, then we'll have to talk about AI before the end, because that's kind of huge tie in there. But let's start with cloud and cloud costs. So I think, you have extensive knowledge of the cloud providers, the factors going into costs. We'll try and talk about a lot of different areas, but you work with multiple providers. Maybe you can start by contrasting, the providers you work with, the differences between them, not necessarily to criticize any providers, but just kind of give a bit of perspective on what you see out there.
Yeah, I would tell way back when I worked for IBM, I had a manager who said, it's not disparagement, it's positioning, but I'll try to be nice to all of them. Mm-hmm. Here at Comply, we use Amazon a lot, and we're also on Google. In my previous role, we actually used Azure as well. Look, they're all kind of selling the same kind of thing. I was actually with Google earlier today. People think of it as just renting CPUs in a data center and renting storage attached to those CPUs and so on. But actually, a lot of the cost and what they provide for you and what they're really charging for is management of the software stack. If you look at the cost to them, most of it is in kind of software maintenance. There's also issues for them around managing, very large farms of computers and maintaining things like firmware and things at those levels, making sure it's secure and so on. So from our point of view, there's a kind of side discussion going on at the moment, I think, in the industry about should you be on cloud, or is it actually cheaper to go and run your own data center and go back to colo or something like that? And if you've got a really simple stack, that makes sense, because the balance between hardware and software, then in that case, you are just renting hardware and you just put a little bit of software on top of it. But I think if you're doing something complex, and it doesn't have to be as complex as what we're doing, then the cloud providers can provide genuine value. The problem is the kind of SaaS pricing, because of this positioning around you think you're buying hardware, but what they're actually selling you is software. Ultimately, a lot of the pricing in all cases has been somewhat obfuscated by that, and deliberately so. I think that's the case in the cloud. If you've ever tried to buy APM software from the likes of kind of App Dynamics, New Relic, Datadog or something, that is really kind of advanced course pricing understanding. You're kind of buying a whole load of units that you don't understand anything about. It's a bit easier with cloud, but I think it is kind of consistent between them. I don't think there's a massive difference between them in terms of what they're selling and the way they price. The devil's always in the detail.
There's the promise of a big abstraction with the cloud where you just don't care, but when the truth comes, to your point, there's a lot of details that you do care about. We find that even with Google, for example, there's a lot of processor details under the covers that vary that you kind of need to be aware of if you really want to optimize. And your point is extremely interesting that the software and the management of the software stack varies as well. So you're really buying into something that's very complicated, and you can't just kind of abstract it to the point where it's just a simple thing. It actually is almost everything that existed in IT is encapsulated now in this one little thing that you're buying, the security, the networking, everything. It's a great point. I assume your organization spent a lot of time digging into that and making sure that where you run your apps, like there's a lot of requirements that have place requirements on the infrastructure that you need to absolutely make sure are met.
We're not necessarily multi-cloud in that we don't typically run the software in kind of, if your Amazon instance goes down, then you fail over to Google. We're cloud agnostic, so that the software can run on Google and it can run on Amazon. That gives us a number of choices. If you go down that particular route, then it narrows your choices on the software. You can't take anything that's proprietary from Amazon because it's super proprietary on Amazon because it's not going to run on the Google side, and vice versa. That was a very deliberate thing for us, and it's taken a lot of kind of careful architecture not to end up in that space. For example, some Amazon software requires you then to run a Lambda at some point in the workflow. The Lambda is not portable over to Google. And there are other things which are not portable. We run Kafka, for example. We don't run SQS, SNS, Kinesis, anything like that is non-portable. So it does narrow those choices. And I hear it from other CTOs, why don't you take this template, because Amazon's got this template and everything works together. And then you look at it closely and actually it doesn't work together. And it doesn't work together very well. If you want to gather an expert on all these components, you have to get like 15 people from Amazon in the room. That's kind of a myth. And I think I prefer our path of kind of just taking the software we need to run and then running it on a managed cloud provider, which is, I think that works well for us. Actually doing it in a way which is cloud agnostic, I think, has provided a healthy outcome.
Yeah, agnostic is exactly the right word, I think, because you're just making sure that you're not heavily invested in things you can't get out of. But like you say, and I don't think we see anybody really dynamically flipping between providers on the fly, but the ability to move. Because I think, and you had made the point in another discussion we had around that giving you leverage. You need to make sure that you have some way to not get completely locked into the provider or even have multiple providers. And, and that feeds into things like discounting and how you can get discounts. So maybe, when it comes to cost, I guess discounts are usually the starting point. What are your perspectives on that between the providers?
I think it's super relationship based. I have a lot of discussions about that with my peers, and we kind of try to share notes to the extent that we're not covered by NDAs. I don't publish their prices other than list price. Relatively few people pay list price. You can end up in long-term agreements with either party. Same thing applies with Microsoft. You can negotiate a discount for those. Anything unusual, you will be told, will pass up the management chain. It will go up this kind of 50-layer totem pole and be declined or approved. Ultimately, it depends upon your relationship with your particular account manager, potentially that person's management as to what you get, because there are always ways. They generally have tools in their back pocket to kind of supplement discounts through credits, through lots of different programs and so on. So we have a person effectively full-time just managing vendor relations and managing that relationship. And I try to maintain as good a relationship as I can be a bit bumpy with our account managers. Sometimes you need to go and ask them for a favor. And most of those don't come through official channels. So, the first thing I would say is cultivate a good relationship with your account manager. Second thing is, in the words of Ronald Reagan, trust but verify, figure out what's going on and also ask what's possible. Programs that are available from these companies are so complex that you really have to kind of dig into them to understand.
And ironically, again, that promise of cloud being completely dynamic and pay for what you use, a lot of people start to get tied into long-term agreements that put a floor on what they can, or on what they spend. And it kind of starts to look a lot like not an on-prem environment, but something not quite as elastic anymore. And I guess the trick is to hit the right level of commitment so that you can flex but still not overpay. So it seems like it's become a very complicated, and to your point, relationship-driven art to get to the optimal agreements.
You shouldn't go into it too naively, I think. The general approach of the cloud vendor, in my experience, is basically send a bunch of consultants in, figure out the size of your estate, make some kind of predictions about estate growth. By estate, I mean, let's say you were spending, I don't know, $2 million on cloud, right? Or you think your likely spend this year was $2 million. And then they come in and say, well, actually next year it's $3 million and the year after that is $4 million. You will then be confronted with a potential deal for $2 million, $3 million, $4 million because they want all your business. And I think typically that is unwise. Committing all your likely business to one provider basically leaves you absolutely no room for subsequent discussion. Mm-hmm. And in my experience, basically you shouldn't do that. You should figure out what makes sense on both sides, but also leave enough room for leverage and subsequent discussion. Because maybe you don't need 3, 4, 5, or 1, 2, 3, or whatever in terms of the equation. Maybe you need some more flexibility than that. And maybe you need to use multiple providers, in which case, where's the room for them going to come from? And you can get pushed quite hard down this path of commit all your spend to us and we'll give you this fantastic deal. But in my experience, I don't know what the word is, but the fantasticness or whatever of that deal is somewhat overrated.
Yeah, and I often think sometimes it lets them put it on the books differently. If it's recurring revenue versus on demand, they just love to have you signed up for anything for multi-year. And, that's a good segue. We saw, I think you had mentioned kind of an inflection point around cost, related to COVID and other things. And we saw companies that couldn't really downsize very effectively because they had a floor that they were committed to. So chopping out servers didn't chop out any cost. And it kind of leaves, so there's how optimistic or pessimistic are you about the future depends on where you hit what point you manage to.
Yeah, I think things have changed quite a lot, actually. I mean, I joined I joined Comply January 22. I think at that point, in several respects, the market was overheated. You could see that in the labour market for technology in London. There was a very high rate of churn because labour salaries were inflating significantly. You could see valuations for companies were significant. Lots of rounds being done, significant up rounds on valuation. And then round about the middle of 22, possibly associated with what was going on in the Ukraine, the laws of physics changed. You were suddenly in a kind of, I'm going to try and avoid science fiction illusions at this point, but you're suddenly in a kind of different universe where the laws of physics operated slightly differently. And suddenly all that thing you were assuming about growth metrics against which you were optimizing, which is over the last few decades has been the kind of default state of startups and scale-ups, suddenly it's more about how can you contain cost, how can you start to close margins, in particular as a kind of private company. You're typically kind of just trying to get the margin closer, improve the path to profitability. Organizationally, we then had to kind of very quickly pivot into cost management mode, doing a very kind of tight review of what we're spending and where, as opposed to worrying less about that and more about how we're servicing the just pure top line of the business in terms of growth. Those
are the competing factors, right? Is it if someone's in growth mode and worried about performance, then it's don't worry about the spend. And then when there's a retrenchment, I think we all saw it, it's definitely cut. I saw like a broken record saying, we like to think of, there's two aspects to the spend. There's the unit price you're paying and the discounts that affect that. And then there's how much stuff you're buying. And both seem to be a problem where, people have done a good job of getting discounts. Maybe not as good as you from the sounds of things, but it's the amount that you're using is really the big culprit. Let's talk about that for a minute. And it's just the systemic over provisioning that occurs, because when you really want to cut costs, you can only go so far with discounts. Then you have to start removing database servers or scaling down your grid. And so, what's your What's your view on that and effective ways of kind of dealing with that?
Well, I think there are multiple layers of it. We started to look at the contracts, figure out, how we could improve our situation, how we could look at other cloud suppliers and so on. And that's a long path. You have to invest a lot in re-architecture. From our point of view, we started that, as I said, late last year. A lot of that will deliver probably in the last quarter of this year and sort of going forward from there. The kind of other wins that you've got are other areas where I'm completely wasting resource. Typically, you've got accounts that are left on. There's stuff that has been spun up by developers and so on. So you look at, should these things be provisioned at all, or should they just be switched off? In particular, I think an area to look at is test environments. How many test environments have you got? How much live should there be? Mm-hmm. In other words, how big is the test environment versus the production environment? How big should it be? We've made a lot of movement towards canary testing, so actually using our production environment for testing, as opposed to running a whole series of layered environments that cost as much. A particularly easy thing is just should your test environment be switched on while the developers are not doing anything. If you haven't got automated testing going on 24 hours, we do have a fair bit, but some people don't. So you can save money just by kind of effectively turning off the lights when you leave the office. Mm-hmm. We looked also at our buying patterns for things like reserved instances, balance between reserved instances, spot instances, and so on. So you can buy all these different types of marketplace offerings from Amazon and indeed for Google. And there are companies and mechanisms for you to effectively rent those and then sell them back on the market fairly quickly. So there are instant trading platforms. And so we started to make use of those. We looked in certain areas at code optimization, said, well, this particular piece of code, is it efficient as it should be? So we brought in a lot more observability to understand what was going on. And we also use your platform, which is how we were introduced, to look at, in particular, if you look at kind of complex deployments, and we were using Kubernetes all the way through. To what extent were we over-provision for certain services, in particular for certain Kubernetes-oriented services, and could we scale that back? We basically attacked it on about 5 or 6 different fronts, one of which was kind of the over-provisioning, but the others were also important. In the end, we cut our compute spend by about 50%. We cut our networking costs by about 20%. Database, probably less so, probably about 5%. And actually, RDS is quite a difficult nut to crack from a cost optimization point. But we're, again, because of the cloud agnosticism, we're actually engineering RDS out of the equation. So effectively, database becomes a huge storage network problem rather than a database as a service problem.
Wow. I mean, 50% is a fantastic number. You might be getting some phone calls after this podcast.
Well, don't give out my number. That's the
okay. We're talking to Mr. X right now.
Yeah, that's right.
I want to pick up on one point you said, because I think it's fascinating, is the cost of a development environment, and particularly in a container environment. And I'm going to get a bit technical for a second. We've seen cases where people maintain a complete copy of their production environment as a test environment for containers. But the thing about containers is that what ruins a container's day is not what resources it was given. You give it its request, and maybe the limit has to be high enough, but it's what all the other containers around you are doing. If you have the wrong provisioning systemically, then you can be at risk from the other workloads because you're not protected. But if you run a test workload in an empty cluster, of course it's going to work. We found cases where there's huge cost in maintaining a full dev replica to run 1 or 2 workloads in it to see if they work. The way containers work is, of course it's going to work because there's no neighbors to ruin your day. I think it was hundreds of thousands a year for an environment that was actually no value for testing anything.
I think that my general position on layered environments, though, is I've used them in different companies. I've never thought they worked. Because actually what happens is they consume a lot of resources. They don't produce production value, production grade results. And quite often what happens is that the production environment config drifts over time against the real config because people come in, they make changes to reflect, the configuration of the new bit of code they want to introduce and stuff like that. Or they make, very customer specific changes, depending on what type of business you're in. But we're in a B2B business, so that happens. And you end up testing an environment against workloads that don't reflect real life, on actually software that doesn't reflect real life. And so, I'm a big advocate of feature flags, API versioning, canary testing, and trying to do stuff against the production environment. Because otherwise, the cost of maintaining those multiple environments and just keeping them in sync Firstly, I think it's unachievable anyway, but also you spend a lot of time just kind of chasing that around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the canary approach seems much more practical and in line with, the way things operate today. Back to over provisioning, if engineers make something way too big and they run it in a, for example, container environment, I mean, it's good for them because they're protecting themselves in some ways, but it's bad for the system overall. So when you start to map the costs of a container environment, it's hard to map it back to individuals, and it's hard to get individuals to act on that. What are your views on that? If you see horribly over provisioned container environments, have you had success in getting the individuals to kind of dial it back?
Well, it depends what you mean by getting the individuals. As I said, we run a separate infrastructure group. So it's more a case of, so teams own services. They own the config for the services via Helm charts and so on. Mm-hmm. Those Helm charts are then deployed through a pipeline built by the SRE team. And we do have checks to stop stuff going out that's out of policy. All of that has been in place for some time. The issue isn't so much what happens in development or even test, it's what happens in production, where the easiest way of solving a short-term problem and reducing pain is just throw more resource at things. And gradually what happens over time is you get 10 of those decisions taken in different circumstances. Ultimately you get a kind of, that sediments into something that's quite, well, I'm mixing metaphors here, but it becomes something very difficult to disentangle as to how it's got into that state. We did this with Densify, was just kind of run through every one of our Kubernetes deployments and say, what should it be? Where should it be in terms of configuration? And you can see some of the more problematic services were running at like 50 times in terms of config where they should be. In terms of their max, whatever the maximum being set up for Kubernetes, they didn't necessarily scale up to that immediately, but the minimums were still kind of a multiple of where the recommended level should be.
I think there's a tendency to size to peak, which as an individual or an individual team deploying something is the only thing you can really do because you don't know what the system is doing. But when it runs in the bigger body of workload, everything's peaking at different times. It's horribly wasteful. So even just doing the right decision, it lacking the context of what else is running in the environment can lead you to a lot of inefficiency. But again, and what you're saying is we see this a lot too, is things are way beyond that level. They're just provisioned. We've seen things that are using 10 millicores that were giving 1,000 millicores. They're 100 times too big. So it's pretty common out there. And it's, you mentioned observability. It's hard to fix sometimes because you don't even know what's happening. There's a lot of little things popping up and down in these environments, and people don't have time to keep track of what they're all doing and whether they're all over provisioned. So it's a scale problem, and visibility is a big problem as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the deployments were probably done by uneducated guess, right? Because the cloud providers provide, for example, memory-oriented instances and compute-oriented instances and so on. And so somebody's gone, we're going to use a lot of memory on here, so I'll take one of those. And maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. Maybe that wasn't the best in terms of which instance type to use. So It's not just the sizing, but it's also optimizing to the right type as well, based on real world experience and testing.
So they're not just buying too much, they're buying the wrong products, actually. You've had a big track record with containers. I think, a while back we would have said, let's talk about the future, let's talk about containers. I think containers are now the present, and let's talk about what's next. Given your science fiction knowledge, we'd be remiss in not talking about AI for a minute. It's everywhere. It sounds like you folks use it. You want to talk a bit about that?
We're doing a number of things with generative AI, mainly with generative AI as a service. We're not kind of deploying our own, rolling them up and running them on a whole bunch of GPUs anywhere. So one of the things about Comply is that we, as well as providing all those services to check risk and to check fraud and all those things I described earlier, that's all based on a very large corpus of data that we acquire based on research teams, which are actually based in our Romanian center. We want to be able to scale that significantly. We currently take in, several 100,000 sources. We want that to be able to scale without actually sort of, say we wanted to scale it by a factor of 3 or 5. We don't want 3 times more or 5 times more people doing kind of manual research. So we're using generative AI in that area to figure out how to optimize and automate some of our data acquisition methods. I think there's also, in the area of customer optimization, as generative AI gets better at writing code, it may be the case that we start to look at, we've got a mixture of Python code and Kotlin code. And Kotlin code, compute-wise, runs a fair bit more efficiently than Python. So it may be the case we start to look at that from could we run these bits of code? Could we convert them to Kotlin quickly? I don't think the code generation stuff is there yet. I think it will be several kind of generations before it gets there. But yeah, we're doing a bunch of stuff on data acquisition with Gen AI. And then Gen AI is also affecting us partly because it's just being used by, in particular, the search engine optimization industry, a lot of which is kind of just depends on putting kind of junk data into the internet. We have, as well as that team doing data acquisition, we have another team just doing data and source research on kind of where the best places are to acquire the data we need. I think those roles will become more important as AI-generated content takes off, because there'll be a lot more trustworthy content on the internet. The ability to distinguish between that and the content we trust is going to be a far more significant requirement going forward, because the ability to auto-generate that amount of genuine-looking junk didn't exist before, and suddenly it exists now.
I think there was a persona that was the AI had focused on that was actually from a TV show. Was there?
Yeah. And I might not have the kind of full story of this, but I was talking to our data guys the other day. And there's a popular show in the UK called Emmerdale Farm, which is a soap opera. I'm sure you have those in America and Canada. And but this was, the typical English one has been going, since the 50s. For some reason, there was a kind of news item about a valid entity that is of interest, like a politically exposed entity, and something had happened to them, but it turned out to be the plot of this soap opera. And so it gets picked up, picked up by the system. It suddenly gets picked up by, all the search and regeneration systems on the internet. And before you know it, this thing has gone viral without it ever being true in the first place. And I think you'll see far more occurrences of that going forward.
That's amazing and scary, and probably a very general problem for everybody, for all humanity. But I mean, in your business, of course, getting to the truth is kind of what you do. So that's great that you caught that example. And one last, I guess, practical question on AI. So when we were watching it very closely, and of course, there's huge amounts of compute going into it. And do you think it's at the point now where the cost of hosting your AI, is that an issue, or is that a tomorrow issue? Or are people just saying, let's just spin this up and get our models working, and we'll figure out how to do it cost effectively later? Or is that right off the bat a problem? I assume this can get very expensive, all this compute.
The SaaS AIs, if you use them by API, don't charge for compute. They effectively charge by the byte. Mm-hmm. And so you're typically, when you use them, you would typically put them in some kind of data pipeline that might, one of the stages of which, before you hand it to the large language model, might do some kind of optimization to reduce any kind of junk before, so that you weren't kind of getting to process stuff you weren't interested in. So there's a whole bunch of kind of, how do you optimize your API calls if you're going to use it on a SaaS basis? If you're deploying your own, then it's going to be a case of, I think you need to know what you're going to use it for. Mm-hmm. Like anything else, before you kind of spend a large amount of money commercially, you should probably make a business case for it. And if you're experimenting with it, then be kind of very careful. I've done businesses before that depended on training far more data than unsuccessful, by the way, businesses. They depended on the requirement to train a very large amount of data before you kind of sell any of the output data. You should be very careful before you kind of invest too much in it, whether it's kind of running a load of GPUs or firing a lot at some kind of commercial service that is charging by the byte.
Yeah, I guess it could be a game-changing capability, or it could be a very expensive science project. And there's probably a lot of people taking the risks out there right now that it's going to be the former.
Yeah, and again, I think it comes back to a lot of the vendors are interested in, getting you hooked on their stuff. And so they have various kind of special offers. I would, figure out with your account manager, what is the special offer around generative AI? Mm-hmm. There's not just, in this case, Amazon and Google and Microsoft, but there's also the people trying to sell who do the chips, who are kind of subsidizing programs. Mm-hmm. So, I would go around and see if you can get some kind of grant to support the work. That is achievable.
I guess let them, there's a lot of people spending a lot of money on this trying to get market share. Let them swallow the cost instead of swallowing it yourself, I guess, at least while they're.
Well, yeah, let them pay to find the business case for it.
Yeah, that's a great, fascinating thought. That's actually a great way to view it. And with that, I think we can wrap things up. I was going to ask you, I love all your literary references, what you're planning to read on what must be an upcoming holiday this summer, but it sounds like you just took your holiday. So
I did. Yeah, I did. We took our spring holiday and our summer holiday quite close together. So we went to Cyprus and then we went to Portugal, both of which were quite warm. And I read, so my degree was in politics. And so if you read the kind of books we had to read when I was at university, you develop speed reading to considerable degree. So when I'm on vacation, I don't tend to read kind of technical or management books because I try to take a proper vacation. So I did read a bunch of sci-fi, and what I normally read is either sci-fi or non-fiction. So what did I read? I read Cory Doctorow, Radicalized. I would recommend that. I think that's a kind of great view of how the immediate future could turn out. It's very kind of Black Mirror-ish. I read A Separation by Christopher Priest, which is a kind of what-if story about World War II. I read The Sea and Summer by George Turner, which is a distressingly, I hope it's not prescient, but it feels prescient view of where global warming could go. And then on the non-fiction side, I read Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall, which is a great book about geopolitics, and also a history book called Line in the Sand about how our problems in the Middle East all go back to the British and the French in like the post-World War One.
Wow.
Apologies on behalf of whatever we did.
That's fascinating. And that sounds like a book a day. I guess you must have, I guess your speed reading comes in, unless you take very long vacations. That's a lot of reading.
Yeah, I find it easier if you don't speak to your family and just read.
The perfect vacation. Mark, thanks so much for joining us today. It was a great conversation. Hopefully we can circle back maybe in some time and see how those books foretold whatever's going to happen in the cloud and container world over the next year. But in the meantime, it's been great chatting with you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Andrew Hillier and Mark Watson, thank you so much. Thank you both. Really appreciate an awesome episode full of incredible content. My name is Brian, producer of Densify Talks, and thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. We so appreciate it. So much more coming, by the way. Incredible content on this podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the show if you have not already so that you do not miss any episodes. And we'd love to hear from you. Densify.com. You can also send us your questions. And also, if you'd like to be on the show, email us, marketing@densify.com. Have a glorious day. We will talk to you in the next episode. Again, thanks so much for joining us. And we are signing off.